Okay, now here's chapter 3 of the story of Gail Borden. And this one is called Two Secrets. And here is the picture at the beginning of the chapter. Look at that wagon. Oh my gosh, is it going in the river? The people in the back look really scared. Let's see what happens. Gail Borden's neighbors didn't say he acted strangely. You didn't say that about a man like Gail Borden, even if he did do things that were, well, a little unusual to say the least. It all started a few years after he moved to Galveston. He came there right after the war to be collector of the port of Galveston. President Sam Houston picked him for the job. He couldn't have made a better choice. Gail Borden was just what this growing little town needed. He saw to it that taxes were collected. He and Penelope were popular with the people of Galveston, but Gail's pay was poor. He had barely enough money to give his family the things they needed. He was glad after a little more than a year to take another job. He became secretary and general agent for the Galveston City Company. This corporation owned the land Galveston was located on. It was developing the city. This job gave him time to work out ideas that had been in his mind for years. It was when he started to experiment with these ideas that the neighbors began to wonder. There were some odd things going on. Gail carried lumber and wagon wheels and large pieces of canvas into his barn. Night after night for months, the neighbors heard him working and hammering there. Other evenings, a great rattling of kettles came from the fig orchard behind his house. He couldn't hide his activities long. He had 6 children, and he knew you couldn't keep youngsters from talking. One evening, the minister came to dinner, and Gail invited him into the orchard. He led his friends to a huge iron kettle over an outdoor fireplace. "What are you cooking?" the preacher asked. "I'm condensing figs. I've a theory you can preserve food by condensing it. I put in water, half a hogshead of sugar, and a cartload of figs. I heat the mixture, and when it is cooked long enough, I press it and preserve it in 10-pound containers." Gail took the minister into a small building nearby and showed him row after row of cans and cases. They're filled with condensed fruit, beef, chicken, and turkey, he said. "I've also condensed many other foods. I believe the process has great value." One midsummer evening, a short time later, the Bordens gave a dinner party. The guests were chosen carefully. Mayor John M. Allen, the editor of the local newspaper, the minister, a wealthy planter, and his 2 daughters, and a few others. Gail served his guests the most unusual dinner that they had ever eaten. It was an odd menu. Concentrated soups, condensed foods, fruits, and extracts. Gail ate heartily and talked of the wonderful flavors he had captured in these dishes. His guests nodded politely. After dinner, he took the party into the garden. He told them that they were about to experience the greatest thrill of their lives. They expected some kind of machine for preserving food. Instead, he threw open the barn doors and showed them the strangest contraption they had ever seen. It had wheels, yet it wasn't a wagon. Had a sail, but it wasn't a boat. There were benches for passengers and a seat up front for the man at the controls. A team of horses pulled the vehicle across the field onto the smooth beach along Galveston Bay. The horses were unhitched, and Gail explained his invention. It was a land schooner. It applied on land the principles used by sailors on the sea. It harnessed the wind. His guests were afraid of the thing. They didn't want to ride in it, but Gail assured them it was safe as their own wagons. They piled in. Gale raised the sail, and the schooner moved down the beach. It gained speed, 5, 10 miles an hour, faster and faster. The passengers yelled for him to stop. The women screamed. Gale tried to slow the schooner down. He couldn't. The women became hysterical. They screamed louder, and the men tried to help Gale. He became excited. He swung the rudder the wrong way. They headed for the sea. He pulled at the controls. The wind blew harder. The schooner dove into the waves. Gale was thrown into the water. The vehicle plunged on. A big wave caught it. It rolled slowly over onto its side and skidded to a stop. That's what's happening there. Do you see him with the rudder in his hands as he's trying to guide it as they're going into the sea? My. The men pulled the women from the wreckage. The water was shallow. No one was hurt. Everyone was frightened. The guest trudged back to his house, the women holding their soaked skirts above their ankles, the men sloshing along with water in their boots. Gale ran from one to the other, assuring them it was an accident, begging their forgiveness. The night was warm. All were young or adventurous or both. By the time they reached home, everyone was laughing at each other, at their host, and his weird contraption. The land schooner was a failure. Gale was the first to admit it, but he turned his inventiveness into other channels. Those early years in Galveston were perhaps the happiest in Gail Borden's life, but it couldn't last. In 1844, yellow fever swept the city. See, there are other things that can sweep a city and cause all kinds of problems. Gale kept his family at home. I wonder if they had to quarantine at home. But he went out each day to help nurse the dying and to bury the dead. Then the fever struck the Borden household. Their 4-year-old son died in March, Penelope in September. Gale helped dig their graves in the garden. Penelope was only 32. 2 years later, he lost another son. Gale was different after that. He stayed to himself. He turned more and more to his work. Gold had been discovered in California. The rush was on. Many died along the way. Still, they kept going. A party leaving Galveston asked Gale to help them prepare for the journey. He promised to make them a meat extract they could use along the trail. The idea wasn't new. The Indians had a concentrated meat. They called it pemmican, and it's Pemmican, pemmican. They made it by cutting buffalo meat or venison into strips. Then they dried the meat in the sun, pounded it fine, mixed it with melted fat, and packed it in the hide bags. Pemmican kept fairly well, but it had a bad flavor. Gale wanted a tasty meat extract. He boiled 120 pounds of beef down to 10 pounds. That's a lot down to a little. Whew. It was thick as molasses and smelled a little like glue. Then came the idea that turned failure into success. He mixed flour with some of the extract, kneaded it into a biscuit, baked it, and left it overnight to cool. The next morning he had a meat biscuit, rich in flavor and food value. The gold seekers bought 600 pounds, enough to keep them strong and healthy when they crossed the desert on the way to California. Dr. Elisha Kent Kane, the Arctic explorer, used Borden's product. Kane and the members of his expedition were forced to abandon ship, and it was their chief food on a 10-week trek across northern wastelands. Dr. Ashbel Smith, former general surgeon of the Army of the Republic of Texas, wrote the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, "I believe there does not exist in nature or art the same amount of nutriment in a small bulk or weight as well adapted to support efficiently and permanently mental and physical vigor as is concentrated in the meat biscuit. Gail and his brother Tom built a meat biscuit plant in Galveston. A magazine writer told how carefully Gail was about the purity and the quality of his product. Everything about the establishment is neat and clean in the highest degree, the article said. In fact, fastidious cleanliness seems to rank with the proprietor as the first of virtues. The article added that only the finest meat and flour were used. Gail felt there would be a big demand among city people for his meat biscuit. He considered it ideal for soups, broths, and gravies. He thought it perfect for hospitals where food with small bulk and good nutritional qualities were considered important. He believed the product ideal for men who had to travel long distances, soldiers, sailors, explorers, travelers. He was elated when Colonel V.E. Sumner of Fort Leavenworth wrote the War Department in Washington, "I have tried the meat biscuit and find it all and more than the inventor thinks it is. I lived upon it entirely for several days and am convinced that I can live upon it for months and retain my health and strength. I am decidedly of the opinion that we ought to commence using it in the Army at once. And I believe for all active operations in the field, the advantages of this food will be so apparent that it will come into general use in a few years." Then came even more acclaim. Gail personally exhibited his meat biscuit at the International Exhibition in 1851 in London. He was the only American food given a prize. The meat biscuit won the Great Council Medal of the exhibition. Its inventor was elected an honorary member of the London Society of Arts. Gail could see nothing but limitless possibilities for his product. He returned from London in high spirits and expected almost overnight success. He contacted the steamship lines. A few bought small supplies. To increase sales, he went into the galleys of tramp schooners. He cooked meals centered around the meat biscuit. The ship's cooks were indifferent. He tried the hospitals. He cooked more meals. The young doctors laughed at him. He spent months in Washington trying to sell the Army and Navy. They refused to give his meat biscuits a trial. During this period, Gail was in New York City and Washington most of the time. Friends and relatives cared for his children. For more than 5 years, he lived from hand to mouth, but he refused to quit. He wrote a friend in Texas, "Don't infer I have given up, for I know that the meat biscuit is one of the discoveries of the age. But the rub is, my debts are due. Every piece of property I have is mortgaged. I labor 15 hours a day, day in and day out." Golly, he had done a lot. There's one other picture of him selling the meat biscuits to the gold rush people going on to California. Interesting. I wonder if meat biscuits would pull up in Google. Interesting.